So, what I thought we would do this morning, in the rather than repeat the podcast, there's one or two ideas that we're going to start with, just to make sure we're all starting from the same place, especially if you've not had time to listen. In the back of Oliver's book, he has 10. What does he call them? 10 tools for embracing your finitude. Is that how you would say it? Basically, the fact that we're finite. I don't think I even knew that finitude was a word, which just shows that Oliver is much more intellectual, certainly, than I am. But the 10 tools are actually very practical. And so I thought we would have a go at going through those 10 very quickly, and then just seeing within those 10, which are the one or two that feel like they might be most useful for you at the moment, because those 10 tools are quite varied. Having spent some time rereading them, thought about how to bring them to life this morning, I thought it'd be interesting for us to explore them together. And you'll be able to explore them and help each other in the chat as always. So as we're going through, if there are things you want to share or things you've seen, like people talking about Cal Newport's work, as always, just feel free to add those into chat so that we can all learn together and from each other. So just 3 ideas just to make sure that we're all starting from the same place. As I said, I think Oliver's big idea really is the fact that we do sort of feel like, oh, there'll be a moment where we have more time. So we maybe don't feel like we're doing a good job right now, but there will be a moment where suddenly it gets better. This sort of almost optimism, we are all naturally quite optimistic people. There's this optimism that at some point we'll be able to make everything balance and work. And this is a temporary state. And he said that when we start to accept that it's not infinite, we don't have infinite time, we all have the same amount of time, and almost put some boundaries around going, oh, well, actually, no, it's finite. So there is only so much time that I have to work with. So that's sort of a mindset point that he makes. He then says, and I think this is interesting and something I certainly find hard, because I like to be in control. This is the point that we're kind of our success metric sometimes when we think about our time is, do we feel in control of it? What Oliver would argue is that actually we just need to accept that, yeah, we're in control of some of our time, but almost accepting that some of our time and some of the things that we want to do with our time is actually out of our control, which in some ways is you feel like that's going to be quite demotivating, but it can be quite liberating when you really start to think about it. And I love being in control. It drives a lot of who I am, definitely, and what I do. So that feels quite uncomfortable as a concept. But the more you think about it, the more actually it can be quite liberating, because you think it allows you to let go. You know, we've talked before about this idea of sometimes you've got to choose what are you going to let go of, and not almost get frustrated or waste energy trying to control things that you can't control. It is quite a good way of thinking about things. If I just put it in a very practical perspective, it's like, I don't like being late for things, but when you've got a 4-year-old, inevitably at some point you are going to be late for some things because he doesn't put his shoes on, and that list could go on, and I could get very frustrated. And I think I used to get quite annoyed. I'd get annoyed with him, I'd get annoyed with everyone else, because I don't like to be late. Whereas actually, once you sort of let go of that, going, yeah, at times you can't really control, or certainly I can't really control my 4-year-old. He's probably a bit old now to call him a toddler. But when you sort of let go of that idea of like being able to control him, I have a much better relationship with him now. And also accept the fact that sometimes I might be a bit late. Sometimes you might not be quite arriving at the time you said you were going to arrive. And so it's an interesting mindset point. The other thing in the book that really struck me, I was re-listening to the podcast yesterday. I'm not sure it made the edit. I didn't quite get to the end of the podcast, but I don't think it made the edit. Was this point of, this is how much we think we can get done in a day. So I think I can get all of this stuff in a day. I'm like, right, yeah, by the end of the day, I'm going to be able to do this much. The reality is that by the end of the day, you're probably going to get this much done. We overestimate how much we can do in a day. We're not very good at estimating how long tasks take. For whatever reason, our brains are not very good at that. Again, perhaps it's that optimism, that ability to think, or just squeeze that in, and also maybe thinking that we're more efficient or more robotic than we think we are. And she's not here this morning, but I really wish Helen was here right now, because Helen absolutely overestimates how much she can do. She can do a lot. Believe me, I have never seen anyone who can do so much in a day. And even then, she overestimates what she can do in a day. And I'll say to her, like, oh, maybe just like one less thing would be okay. She'll be like, no, I'll be able to do this, and I'll be able to do that, and I'll be able to do that. And I'm just thinking, like, no way, you'd be superhuman if you could. And so what's interesting is this is less about thinking, oh, well, actually, what I'll do is I'll just make that list shorter, and more about accepting that there will always be more to do than time that we've got. So these are quite, and as I said in the podcast, for people who've listened, Oliver's interesting because he's an interesting mixture of, he's quite philosophical. So he does talk about some of these very big ideas, but then he is really interested in how do you make this practical. So let's talk about these 10 things that he has, this 10 tools, he calls them, for embracing this sort of, these principles. Like, what might this look like in terms of how you spend your time and your relationship with time? So I'm going to whiz through all 10 and then ask you to sort of vote for your favorites, some of which I think some of you might have already talked about. So first one, I've definitely seen this one, is this idea of an open versus closed list. The idea here is that your closed list probably only has 3 to 5 things on it, and your open list can be as long as you want it to. The really important thing here is that nothing can make it onto your closed list until something else has gone. Does that make sense? So that's got to be finished, and that's got to be finished for anything from your open list to move across. So your closed list is essentially, I think this is a different way, the more I think about this, of doing Ansof's matrix. So for any of you who've done urgent, important, it's highly important and it's highly urgent, this feels like a way of taking that matrix and putting it and applying it to your to-do list, if you are someone who likes to-do lists. What I personally like about this actually is this one. And I suspect if Helen was here, she'd like this side of it. But I like the fact of going, sometimes it's really helpful for me to get everything out of my brain onto a bit of paper, but then not see that as the pressure to think, well, that's everything I've got to do right here, right now. What I've got to do right here, right now is I've got to do the stuff that's on my closed list. And until that's done, nothing can move across. I suspect that's quite a good way of just thinking about, it doesn't mean that you can't have ideas, because that's why I think I like this, because I'm like, well, I've got an idea and I don't want to lose that idea, or I don't want to waste that idea. Everything that you could do, want to do, you're interested in, can make it onto that open list, but your closed list then helps you to be a bit more realistic. So I quite like that as a way of thinking about to-do lists. What's the next one? Next idea. This is the one I did actually challenge Oliver on, because I was trying to figure out how this works in reality, is this idea of what he calls serializing. So his argument is it is much better to do one big thing and keep making progress on that one big thing than it is to start loads of stuff at the same time. Now, when I challenged him on this, what he really means here, of course, we all have to do more than one thing at once. I was like, I'd love the luxury of just doing one thing at once. None of us have that in our jobs. What he's trying to get to is, don't try and start too many things at once. He talks about limiting your work in progress and actually sticking with that one thing, or those 2 things that are really important to you. Sometimes the reason we end up doing these is because it feels good, because we make lots of small bits of progress in lots of places. Whereas sticking with this is harder and it's more uncomfortable. And there'll be moments where you feel like you're in the opposite of flow, reminding ourselves that to find flow, it has to feel really uncomfortable first. That's always a good motivator to stick with these things. So I think really what he is talking about here is sort of combining, if this first idea here is very practical, what's on the list, this is more about how you approach your work. So not trying to have loads and loads of medium things. Yeah, you've got some stuff that you've got to get done in your jobs, because we all have that, but only have maybe 1 or 2 big things, and then do it actually in a very opposite of squiggly. His argument is do it in a very linear fashion. Do one thing, then do the next one. And he would suggest you'll then make more progress rather than making a bit of progress over here, a bit of progress over here, a bit of progress over here. Might be quite useful if you're somebody who procrastinates, so it helps you to stick with one thing, or if you quite like the kind of the dopamine hits you get from small wins and lots of progress in lots of different areas. I always think this one doesn't work as well for me because actually I am naturally more like that anyway. Helen is definitely more like that. And so sometimes she'll be like, oh, let's just do these like fun, quick things because then it feels good. So this will depend a bit on your personality. I love this idea. I don't think this made the edit either. As I was listening back to the podcast, and I was like, oh, I found this really helpful. This idea is about imbalance, about embracing imbalance and very consciously deciding what are you going to be good enough at. He actually talks about it as decide in advance what you want to fail at. I prefer good enough, just because I think the words that we use do frame how we think about ourselves. So I sort of go, I don't really want to talk about, I'm going to fail at parenting. I'd rather not say that. I'd much rather say it's okay to be a good enough parent, particularly in the week, which is definitely my reality. And the reason that this is so important is when you strategically and consciously choose what you're going to be good enough at, we have a very different relationship with it to if it just happens to us. Does that make sense? Again, this really, really resonates with me. So I go, oh, it's okay to have a bit of my weeks always have an imbalance in terms of if I think about in a week, spend way more time doing work than I do, let's use parenting, than doing any parenting. You know, I usually read my little boy a book before he goes to bed. As long as I do that most days, don't really mind what happens the rest of the time. I spend most of my weeks working or, you know, occasionally going for a walk by myself. And I choose that imbalance. And I'm quite consciously going, oh, like that feels like it's good enough. And if we don't get to do every school project, and if I'm not very active on the WhatsApp groups that are a bit overwhelming, I don't mind. I give myself a break on those things. So I think choosing sometimes, now that's a big area of your life, which you're very much allowed to judge me for. So I go, oh, I'm choosing to do that in terms of, that's a big circle, parenting, but it can be a small thing. So it could be within your work. I also think it's really helpful to know what are you going to be good enough at. So just in a work context, going, well, that project I just want to be good enough at. This relationship just needs to be good enough. I don't need to overinvest in everything. Personally, I find that really, really helpful. And there is actually quite a lot of evidence around just how helpful this good enough mindset is for us in terms of our day-to-day lives. Really practical one. This is about having what does he describe it as? A done list. So I did this actually at the start of COVID. So this is the idea of don't just have a to-do list. As you go through the day, have a what have I done list. The way that I used to do this at the start of COVID, when I was sitting in my mum and dad's house, was I would have post-it notes on the wall. And actually I was in sort of an alcove, so it worked really well. And on one side of the alcove, I'd have these post-it notes with the things that I wanted to get done. And then every time I did one of them, I moved it onto the other side of the room. And so this other side of the room essentially became my done list. It was very motivating in a time that was very hard. I actually don't do it now. And I think that these things, sometimes you pick and choose when they're most useful for you. But if I think this is helpful, maybe if you feel like you're not making progress, because we're all making progress, more progress than we give ourselves credit for. Visually, I did find, this is not Oliver's point, he just suggests sort of doing the done list. Visually, having post-it notes you're moving is nice, because I would keep that done list for a week. So even if only one moved over one day and two moved over the next day, by the end of the week, inevitably there'd be more than 5. So you would be building, it would be additive as the week went on. And I think that can be really useful. I also do it every time I'm doing one of those big projects. So writing a book is really hard and a really big bit of work. This is exactly the approach I take to that, where I'm thinking, crikey, I've got to stick with this one really, really big thing in a very serial fashion. Each time I do the first draft of a chapter. I'm going to move that post-it over. Each time I get a quote from for our advice from all areas, I'm going to move it across. So I have done this in a slightly different way to Oliver describes, but I quite like a post-it note. This next one, a bit different. He talks about choose who you are going to help, which is interesting. It's not really something I'd thought about before. His argument here is sometimes we spend time either worrying about we're not helping people enough, so it takes up lots of our mental time and mental headspace, or we try and help lots of people all at the same time, and almost, almost that you're kind of scattering. So you're not really getting below the surface because one person's getting a bit of your time. Maybe he actually talks about it in the context of like charities and social causes, and maybe it's getting involved in your school's PTA. Maybe it's a campaign or a cause that you're really passionate about. And what his argument here is going, essentially, it's sort of pick your battles. It's going, just decide for now, who are the people, the cause, the campaign. What is the thing that you really want to, where do you really want to be helpful? And just do one thing and do one thing really well. And I think this actually really helped us in the early days of Amazing If, when we were thinking, what are we trying to do with Amazing If? Who are we really trying to help? And we always wanted to be very inclusive. We're like, everyone. And I do. Our mission is to make careers better for everyone. And I still do want to help everyone. But this approach has actually been really useful to think, well, who do we help first? Who do we now help? Who might we help in 2 years' time? So it doesn't mean you can't help more than one person or more than one group of people, but focus your time. So I do like that sort of, there's a slightly different concept in terms of your time, but I think it is quite useful. This, a really practical one. So I half like this idea and half don't. He talks about, with tech, obviously a big part of our time, single-use devices. This actually really made me stop and think, because his example of this is the Kindle. And I read loads, fiction, not non-fiction, but I read fiction a lot. And Kindles are a single-use device. I mean, who uses their Kindle for anything other than reading? Because they're useless at it. And also that's sort of brilliant, because I never, while I'm reading my fiction books, I never think, just going to check Instagram, just going to check my WhatsApp messages. I just read the book. Whereas on my phone, which I do occasionally, if I've forgotten my Kindle, I actually use the Kindle app on my phone. If I'm reading on my phone, which I wouldn't advise, it's not a very good experience, of course you check your WhatsApps, of course you check your email, because it's a multi-use device. I actually did quite like that idea. So like the other day, I was talking to someone about buying a book, and she was like, oh, I'm going to open my laptop now to go onto Amazon or Waterstones, wherever she was going, to buy this book. And I was like, open your laptop, just like do it on your phone. And I mean, obviously I didn't judge you, I didn't say it out loud, but that's definitely what I thought. And then I was like, oh, that's interesting. By almost compartmentalizing what we're using our tech for, it does redefine our relationship. So for example, even though we do loads of work with LinkedIn, some of you might have seen the advert, I don't have the LinkedIn app on my phone intentionally, because I think LinkedIn is all about my work and my professional context. I don't think I need it on my phone. I don't think it helps me. I don't think it makes me more efficient. I'd much rather keep it on my laptop. So I'm much more conscious now about what I use where. And the other idea, which actually I have tried it and I don't like it, is this idea, I think Helen's done it before, of you can make your devices grayscale so they're a bit less appealing. I just found it really confusing. So I did it and then I can't find anything. I think because I use colours to be like, oh, that's where that thing is. Also, I did it yesterday to try and take a screenshot for today. If you take a screenshot in grayscale and then put it onto a device where you're using colour, it changes it back. That blew my mind. And I lost a good 10 minutes, which is a waste of time trying to work out why that was happening. But I do quite like that, being very conscious about what you're using your tech for. Oliver was saying to me, he's taken his emails off his phone. I find that scary. I find the idea of taking emails off my phone scary. But I also remember a world where I used to work in where I didn't have emails on my phone. So, it's quite an interesting one. Next one, how am I doing for time? Should just about make it, I reckon. Next one. Now, again, Oliver uses the phrase, what does he say? Find novelty in mundanity, which I find a bit bleak. I call this simple pleasures that make you smile, which is much more amazing if, and I'm stealing this from UKU. So this is where you write down some simple pleasures that make you smile and work out, are you nurturing them or neglecting them? And you sort of do a bit of a tick box exercise. And essentially this is making sure that the simple things, which often do give us loads of pleasure. For me, it's getting a nice coffee, it's going for a walk by the river, going for a walk in the park, playing dinosaur top trumps with my 4-year-old, which I always find hilarious because he has to win every single one. And they're really, really simple things. And it's not underestimating or underappreciating how important those things are, and also valuing them in terms of that is a good use of your time. Sometimes we think those simple pleasures are not, because it's not meaningful enough, it's not important enough, but it's sort of giving yourself a break and going, no, those things are important, and they're often free, which is good. Be a researcher in relationships. So Oliver didn't talk about this one. The idea here is very similar to the work that Celeste Headley has done. So if you listen to her podcast with us, if you've looked at her TED Talk, which is brilliant, 10 Ways to Have Better Conversations, one of the best work-related TED Talks, I would say. What this idea here is all about, just start every conversation with curiosity, with a curious mindset, almost with wonder. I like wonder what I'm going to learn from this person. The reason he talks about this idea is sometimes that we struggle to be present in conversations. We perhaps think, is this useful? We get a bit bored. He talks about boredom. Whereas this actually is about how you see every interaction as like a good use of your time. I was actually interviewing last night a lady called Babette Buster, who wrote a book about storytelling and listening under the Do Lecture book series. Her podcast will be out in a couple of weeks. And she does this. She didn't know this was what she was describing, but I was sort of connecting the dots. She said every time she gets in a taxi, every time she has a conversation with someone, just always kind of really curious about them. Helen is brilliant at this. I mean, I'm much more introverted. I sit in a taxi and think, oh, I just want to be quiet. Helen will just sit in a taxi and be curious about everyone. Now, you don't have to do this all the time, but it's a good approach to relationship building. Instant giving. This, I think, relates really well to David Allen. I think that's his name. Have you come across Getting Things Done? And something called the 2-minute rule. This is essentially, if you can do something in 2 minutes, do it. Don't add it onto a list and don't wait. Just do it really quickly. Now, Oliver sort of takes this a step further, and he also talks about if you can give to other people or if you can help very quickly and easily, just do it. Don't spend loads of time thinking about it or coming back to it. I can do this sometimes because I'll think, oh, I'll come back to that later. And then suddenly it's 4 days later. And also I've thought about it too much and it's not a good use of your time. So this idea of like, if you can do it now, do it now. If it's under a kind of 2-minute task, that makes sense. So, if you can just reply back to a message really quickly and be like, yeah, that's great. That's fine. Don't wait to do those things. The other thing that works really well with this is doing all of your 2 minutes at the same time. So if at the end of a day or whenever works for you, start of the day, you go, right, I'm going to do all of my 2-minute tasks, and you're getting rid of all of the distractions and you're just getting through all of those 2-minute tasks. And his final point was about doing nothing. Let me see what he says. He's got a nice phrase on this. He talks about practice doing nothing. And there's a really good quote that he uses, which is a bit philosophical, from a guy called Blaise Pascal, who says, I've discovered that all the unhappiness of men arises from a single fact, that they cannot stay quietly in their own chamber. That is very philosophical, but I do quite like it. And I think this is interesting. Whatever do nothing means to you. I really like the Idler Academy, just as a connection and something that's quite interesting. And they talk a lot about just being able to sit with our thoughts. For example, I find it hard to go for a walk without listening to a podcast. Like, that's a really good example of not practicing doing nothing. Going for a walk is doing something. But we end up combining so many things in our lives. Or when was the last time you spent 10 minutes and you just stopped and just thought about whatever comes into your mind, which is essentially meditation or mindfulness, both of which I'm not very good at. But this is the importance of, we have got to value just having time and space sometimes to do nothing. This is where we get into, the whole industry of like being overproductive, over efficient the whole time. We're like seeking for all of these ways to optimize and maximize everything and every spare moment. Whereas it is okay to just sometimes do nothing. How often do you do that? And can you practice getting better at it? Because I actually think of all the 10, personally, I think this is the hardest. Here's a summary.